Hello? Okay. So, thanks to everybody for being here. We're now going to explore certain Middle East bad actors, moderated by Eric Navarro. Eric is Middle East Forum's director of the Red Sea Security Initiative, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps Reserve, and a graduate of the National War College. In addition, joining the panel is Gregg Roman, our executive director, which you know who he is, so I won't go into his background. Alberto Fernandez is vice president of MEMRI, which is Middle East Media and Research Institute, and a former U.S. ambassador with over 3 decades in the Foreign Service. He served in hotspots including Sudan, Syria, and Afghanistan. And Alex Selsky, who is a senior advisor to the Israel Victory Project, and an IDF reserve major. He previously advised Prime Minister Netanyahu and serves on several national Jewish organizational boards. So with that, here's our panel.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So when they told me I was going to moderate this panel called Bad Actors in the Middle East, I thought they wanted me to take the entire day. But let's keep it to the limited time that we have. We have a lot to get to, as you know. A lot of bad actors, also a lot of what we would call frenemies or organizations or nations that like to play both sides. So I'd like to get the panelists' thoughts on who they are and what the best approach is to achieve our desired results, strategic outcomes in the region. So a quick list that I just made while waiting to come up here. Right? We obviously have the non-state actors like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, which are near and dear to my heart as director of Red Sea Security Initiative, HTS in Syria, which is now, I guess, trying to go legit. Right? We'll see about that. Obviously, the Iran, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Oman, Jordan. So with that, I'd like to open it up to my panelists. I'll start with the ambassador. Did I miss anybody? And of those, and who else should we add? Who should we take off? And what do you think is who are the main folks or nations that we should really focus on?
Well, I mean, how long do I have? Look, I mean, there are 2 ways of looking at this. There are alliances or groupings that are, by their very nature, bad, certainly hostile to U.S. interests. So you have Iran and its axis, so Iran and its proxies and allies that we've seen, that we saw during the Gaza war, and then you have the kind of Sunni Islamist conglomeration of militias, of regimes, of political parties, of terrorists. So you have those 2 in the region, those 2 baskets, you could say. And then you have a third one. You mentioned, some of you may have heard, it mentioned places like Egypt, an American ally. And I would say that's a third basket when you talk about bad actors, which is a more nuanced one, which is this, and that is regimes and nations in the region have their own logic and their own reason to exist, and the principal one is for them to stay in power. And that means that they will, there are regimes that are deeply ideological. We talk about Qatar, for example, right, or the Erdogan regime. There are regimes that are anti-Islamist, say UAE is a perfect example. But then there are these other regimes that will use whatever they need for their own reasons of legitimacy. If it is political Islam, they will use political Islam. If it is xenophobia against the West, anti-Americanism, they will use that. If it's anti-Semitism, they will use that. That's why you'll see, for example, a country like Egypt, an ally of the United States, you go on Egyptian media and you find it filled with, often very filled with anti-Semitic tropes, anti-Western, anti-American tropes, and you would say, well, wait a minute, how can a regime that gets $1 billion a year from the Americans be filled with kind of anti-American content in its media? But it's because they're riding the tiger. They're kind of playing this double game. So I would say that's how you see the region. You have the Shia axis led by Iran, the Sunni Islamist axis, principally Turkey and Qatar, and then you have all these others playing this double and triple game depending on circumstances. I always recall one last thing. I recall Sudan used to have a dictator named Jafar Numeri. Numeri took power in 1969, and he was a communist. He was a far leftist figure allied to Nasser, and during his 16-year rule, he went from leftist to Islamist, hardcore Islamist. And he did it, of course, because he wanted to stay in power, and he used whatever tools he needed to perpetuate himself in power. So.
Thank you. I'm going to have a follow-up on that, and especially on Turkey. But first, Alex, do you agree with this list, or who would you add to this list, and who do you think is the most pressing issue to address?
Well, I think that you mentioned two major players that we have to look at when we speak about the Middle East, is China and Russia. And I think that these are the major players that not only support, but they're actually the enablers, maybe even the architects of the whole instability. And they do it for very simple reasons: money, energy, survival, pride, and resistance to American interference. Or simply speaking, they just fight the West. You know, I was a media advisor of the Prime Minister Netanyahu many years ago, and when I was speaking to the reporters of the Russia Today channel, you know, Russia Today channel, this is the English-speaking Russian governmental channel, the most anti-Semitic media outlet on earth. And when I asked them why you fight Israel so much, they say, we fight America, you're just part of the deal. That was the answer. And I think that we must understand their interests. Now we can speak very long about it, but I would like just to draw your attention to a few things. First of all, Iran, I don't think it's a sovereign player. I mean, Iran definitely has its interests and its ideology, but Russians and Chinese use it for their energy. Iran is 90% of Iranian oil is purchased by the Chinese. With oil, stable, because you have an autocratic regime that doesn't fight within. You know that you talk to one person, maybe you will speak to the same person in 10 years. You know that Russian foreign ministry is at the same position for 20 years. So it's stable, right? And they fight the West. And I always say that many think in the United States that Americans pay the price for supporting Israel. No, Israel pays the price for being an American ally in the Middle East. Now, this is the fact. Now, many was told about the fact that the Palestinian narrative was invented in the Soviet Union in the 60s. But this is the same today as well. Now, Chinese operate Russia to some extent. I claim that Russia is much less powerful than we tend to, think. Their GDP is less than Italy. They're very violent. They're very violent, but they're not as sophisticated as we think. And the economy is very, very bad. And they look at, Ukrainian war. I think that we can see that they're much weaker than we thought. And look what happened in Syria. We tend to think that, Russians control Syria. In a blink of an eye, they were thrown away. But Chinese interests in the Middle East are very high. Now, here ask ourselves today, what happened to Trump? Where's the maximum pressure? Why negotiations, right? So I suggest an optimistic view, and I claim that today's negotiations or relationship by the Trump to the Iranian problem is within the frame of the negotiations with the Chinese and the Russians. Now, if I just want to remind you that the pause of the tariffs war with China was for 3 months, right? So I might think that Trump tells himself, well, let's halt a bit the attack on Iran, possible attack on Iran, and we even will show that Israel is less important, because I'm sure the Chinese within the negotiations tell you don't attack our biggest oil supplier, and we don't want the high prices. Now Russia, I think, plays double game here, because on one hand they want to be aligned with China, but on the other hand they want high prices. So I think that when Russians look on a possible attack on Iran by Israelis or Americans or both, they say, okay, if the prices will go up, nothing bad will happen. I had a piece in Jerusalem Post after Israeli attack on Iran, and I said that one of the biggest successes, I think, of the attack was to show to Iranians, first of all, but to the whole world, that Iran will not be saved by Russia and China, because Russians didn't really run, they said nothing. If I remember, it was not even commented by the Russians, the attack. Chinese said something, but that's maximum. And also one thing I want to say, this alliance is not ideological. It's very, very pragmatic and instrumental, and there is no ideological alliance. Russians are, I want to remind you, they are Christian Orthodox, and Chinese are atheists. For them, it's all instrumental. Okay, Chinese and Russians are very, very used to use these puppets in the Middle East, to their interest, and that's what they do. And they play, in Russian foreign policy, there is a term of multi-vector policy, meaning we can speak, with Hamas and Iran exactly at the same time when we speak with Israel, and they just play. Now, and Arabs sit in the middle and look, okay, whoever will win, and trade with both. And if America will win, we will go with America. And if China will win, which is possible, we will go with China. And also, it's also not a problem if there is no one boss. Can be two bosses, right? So we will play with two bosses. I don't have to choose who I love more, father or mother, right? I can play with both parents. So I think that's, for some extent, the Arabic game. And we all the time have to understand, I claim, for example, that's my last thing, that Houthis are Russian project, not Iranian, because Russians want to show to the whole world that the southern route is bad. Let's negotiate and let's develop the northern route of the Northern Sea, because that's the future. And if they ruin the southern route of Egypt, that will work. And they want to stop the integration of India against China into the Western bloc of economic trade. And I think that we must understand that after all, we'll have to deal with China and Russia. Because if we deal, it's like we always say that if we destroy Hamas, we will get something else. We got Houthis, right? But after all, even if we destroy, sorry for pessimism, but even if we destroy Iran, so these two will find another one. Okay, Africa is big, many bad players in Africa. Okay, so that's it.
There's a lot to follow up there, but let's first give Gregg from Philadelphia, my ringer, to the panel, an opportunity to.
Sure. So in the role of ringer, I also hope to be the role of spoiler. The reason being that I think that this question of who are the bad actors in the Middle East is not just applicable to state actors or even non-state actors. There is a conglomerate of different commercial interests that are not just in the Middle East, but seek to abuse the Middle East and its peoples. I'll give you a quick example. If we were to look at the drilling of the Eastern Mediterranean in search for natural gas, and the entire array of interests that were present there. It really started about maybe 15 years ago, and I'm sure, Alex, you remember this walking around Tel Aviv. You had this gas company that was headquartered out of Texas, Nobel Energy, that was seeking to develop the fields. But they weren't just seeking to develop gas licenses, which were in the Israeli bloc. They were also competing with BP in Egypt. They were competing with Gazprom off the shores of Lebanon and Syria. Cyprus, Greece, Turkey all had their own interests too. And what ended up happening was a fissure was created between the national oil and gas companies of actors who were often engaged in policy which was anathema to Israel, but they found that once offshore, there would have to be alliances that would have to be struck. This is how we got to the Karish deal, which was brought by the Biden administration, which demarcated the economic exclusive zone, the EEZ, between Lebanon and Israel. The first recognition, de facto, if you want to consider it that, by Lebanon and Israel, while the two countries were ostensibly still at war, if we count Hezbollah being part of the Lebanese state. So Israel, because it was in advance in pursuit of its commercial interests, now that Noble Energy Company is owned by Chevron, was forced to make a deal with the devil. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't in Lebanon's interest or in Israel's interest to see who could tap into the Karish field. It was brokered by Europe. It was brokered by the countries like the United States that were saying, look, we're providing the manpower, we're providing the know-how. You want to be able to get a 30% tax for your sovereign wealth fund. And by the way, you're going to have to make a deal with Lebanon if you want us to continue supporting natural gas development and drilling. But there's also an upside to that. Because when you're making a deal with a friend, you often find more in common than you have to divide with each other, which is what's happening now with the Eastern Mediterranean gas bloc. But I'm not going to talk about that because it's the subject of a panel that Michael Rubin will be leading with the heads of the Middle East divisions for Greece and Cyprus's respective foreign ministries. But it's just an example that when you're thinking about hard power, when you're thinking about the interests of these actors, Hezbollah wants to recover the Sheba farms and get 18 more towns and hamlets along the Israeli border. That's not why they're doing it. They're projecting force from their masters in Tehran. But now all of a sudden, Hezbollah was kneecapped. They lost 3,500 of their middle management, 27 out of 28 of the Shura Council and their leaders. Thousands of fighters who could no longer deploy. So they said, you know what? We're going to hold back for a second. We're going to go north of the Litani River. We're going to let Joseph Aoun and the new heads of the Lebanese state, whether it's the prime minister, the president, or the new cabinet, say, you know what? You have your time. You go deploy the Lebanese army south of the Litani River. But it didn't remove Hezbollah as a bad actor. They just have a little bit of a different agenda. Now it's rebuilding instead of engaging in war against Israel. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that, yes, China and Iran and Russia have their interests. Yes, there are two axes which exist. One, the Sunni Islamist axis, which is now growing under the sponsorship of Qatar and Turkey and some other states, and the Iran axis, which may be fading, but they're waiting for a comeback. So when we talk about bad actors, we have to look at those who are not just state or non-state actors, but those who have interests, trade interests, commercial interests, interests of power, ideological interests. And there's this mesh of an XY axis, but there's a really strong Z that goes through it as well, which is those who have a pecuniary interest in the Middle East. To elaborate on Alex's point, let's look at the IMEC corridor, acting as the West's polar opposite to China's Belt and Road.
Right.
The Chinese have the ability to sort of act as a parasite within commercial systems when they're trying to have the construction of new infrastructure in third world countries. I'll give you the example of Sri Lanka. China tried to build a maritime, an air, and a land route to allow its tentacles to go out for the Belt and Road. This idea that China would create a superior logistics system to go west rather than just relying on markets when it goes east across the Pacific. So in terms of air, if you go to any airport in sub-Saharan Africa, you will see this huge sign when you land, Sino Air. You'll see the newest trams, the best paved runways. You'll see storage facilities, both for cold storage and for storage of rare earth minerals, throughout the airport. The second you leave the land of the airport, you'll see a third world country. But the Chinese make sure the airports are great. The same thing applies to ports. If you go to any port, going back to Sri Lanka as the example, the Chinese have a public-private partnership, not like those in the US, where private companies develop, get a 99-year lease, and then hand it back to the US government or the sovereign authority. What the Chinese do is they pair predatory lending along with infrastructure development, where within 3 to 4 years of finishing a port, whether it be in Sri Lanka or Vietnam or Oman or elsewhere, they then know that those governments, not Oman, Oman's actually pretty good, but they know that those governments will default on the loans, and then the ports, for infinity, go back into the control of the Chinese government. The next thing you know, it's Chinese cargo containers coming in at lower rates than Western cargo containers, cargo ships. Then you have a Chinese naval cruiser that will come, and eventually followed by a flotilla. So the Chinese have taken over the air routes into Africa, both where they take off and where they land, and then they control the sea. And lastly, you have rail projects, and you have massive highways, which are the land routes, not going through Iraq, maybe to Jordan, to Israel, or trying to get down to Egypt, but they're picking their supplicants in the region, in the Central Asia and the Caucasus, and saying, you know what? We can get to Europe by way of the road. We'll go China, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and then off to the Bosphorus with anyone who's willing to deal with them. But what's happening now, and this is an exact contrast, is President Trump, President Biden was involved with it too, are creating an alternate route. This is the commercial bad actor that you have to watch out for, not the US and what it's doing to oppose the Chinese, but the Chinese and their surrogates, which is India, by way of sea, to Dubai, building a rail and a road corridor from the UAE through Saudi Arabia to Jordan, into Israel, and out of the port of Haifa onto Europe. So there are plans here which go beyond just the terrorist groups and the actors who are trying to launch missiles against Israel or strike US targets. There is a commercial war, a trade war which is brewing in the Middle East. And that's largely the topic of President Trump's trip last week. But we can get into that on further points.
Yeah, so what you're all describing is a Game of Thrones in the region, with different houses vying for control and conquest in the region. But it also highlights the need to leverage all instruments of power beyond just military action. I'm a big proponent of that. We need to leverage economic, informational, diplomatic. So with that, I'd like to transition to, Greg, you brought up the US, President Trump's recent trip, but I'd like to get your thoughts on the current US approach with any recommendations for how you think we should evolve our strategy in the region. I'll start with you, Ambassador.
Well, I think you have to start with first premises, and that is, what do you want? What are your priorities? I don't want to pick on him. Actually, I do want to pick on him. But there's a guy named Tony Blinken, who was the Secretary of State, who said in Politico, he said, every time I talk to the Saudi foreign minister, I bring up LGBTQ issues. You can go, it's in Politico. Now, I'm not picking on LGBTQ issues, but maybe that's not the first thing that I'm going to talk to the Saudis about. Maybe it's, I don't know, number 2 or number 20, you know? So what Greg and Alex described is the transactional nature of some of our adversaries, certainly Russia and China, and I would say some of the local regimes as well. Certainly Turkey's this way as well. So one good thing that's come out of the Trump visit, and I think of the Trump administration's policy, is that it does look at foreign policy as having a transactional component. Instead of this bizarre kind of otherworldly type of thing. So you have to start with first premises. What is most important for us in the region? And to double down and to look at that And we're always going to have to make trade-offs. And again, this is not a criticism of the administration. We had, for example, one of the places the president visited was Qatar. And you had a $96 billion agreement signed by Qatar to buy Boeing aircraft. That's pretty great for, say, shareholders of Boeing and American workers and stuff like that. At the same time, Qatar is the ministry of propaganda of Hamas and a purveyor of anti-American poison, not just in the region, but throughout the world, including on American university campuses. So I'm not here to say the administration should do this or the administration should do that, but you need to be cold-blooded, cool, transactional in your issues and kind of look at them very clearly and coolly and decide what is most important for you when it comes to country X. For example, Turkey, many ways a bad actor. Is the most important thing for the United States when it comes to Turkey's position, say, on Ukraine? I don't think so. I can think of a lot of other things that would be more important to me. But for the Biden administration, that was one of the most important things about Turkey, right? Was Turkey's position vis-a-vis the Russia and Ukraine and all of that. So I think the priority for us is to kind of look at the world with fresh eyes and kind of look at it very seriously with kind of without ideological filters and make real decisions about how we're going to treat these countries, both our friends and our frenemies as well.
Thank you for that. Alex, so what's your assessment of the current U.S. approach, and do you have any recommendations or specific policies that you'd like the administration to adopt or pursue?
Well, first of all, I think that what West and America as the leader of the West and Israel as the America's, closest ally in the Middle East, first of all, what they have to do is to fight. No way, guys. If we don't fight, we will not win. And to appease the aggressor will not work. I can give you thousands of cases, and I think that Daniel Pipes wrote about all of them, and just go learn history. Every time you appease the aggressor, you get another war. So if America will not fight, it will, the Islamism, Masih talked about it yesterday, right? When we speak about fighting the Middle East bad actors, it's not about foreign policy, it's about your national security here. It's about your children, about our children. I live in Jerusalem, I go with a gun. You want to go with a gun here? That will happen to you in 5-10 years. It's happening already. So first of all, to fight. And if you want to, I'm not calling to, the problem is that every time that we say we have to fight, we're accused by calling to war. But excuse me, all these years of quiet in Europe, after thousands of years of wars, everyone with everyone in Europe, it was not caused by love and peace and, and nice talks. It was a result of a very brutal victory in the World War II. That is the case. So if America doesn't go back to being violent when it beats the enemy, it will not work, because Chinese and Russians, look at them. They push, and when they see that you are pushed, they push more. And our enemies in the Middle East, that's exactly it. Why Palestinians think they win? We now work on, in the Israel Victory Project in Israel, on the question, do the Palestinians and their supporters understand that we win? We think that that we are strong. Do they see our power? Because they see that, they pushed us in the first Intifada, we gave them authority. So they pushed more, we gave them South Lebanon. They pushed more, we gave them Gaza. So they push more. They understand the lesson. So if we appease them all the time and give them, so they will understand that they will kick us out after 200 years. They did it already with the Jerusalem kingdom. You know the history of the Jerusalem kingdom, right? It was a kingdom, Christian kingdom, in Israel in, I think, 11th century that came to control Jerusalem. And the Muslims kicked them out after 180 years. They have time. You know, Chinese and Persians, they look at America and they say, come on, this is what, 300 years? What is for a Persian or for a Chinese 300 years? Even Russians, who are 1,000 years, they may say they're 1,000 years old. I claim much less. But they think they're part of, long civilization. Okay? They call them the civilization. So they think that they can overfight the West. So if the West doesn't fight, if it's economically, militarily, whatever, but fight, not only be nice. And another thing, you're speaking about, LGBT rights when Americans speak to Arabs. One of the things that, and I see, I follow Russia and China, and one of the things that pisses them really off is that, don't intervene, don't tell us how we have to live. They want to be not democratic. They don't want democracy, okay? China doesn't want democracy. Russia doesn't want democracy. Arabs don't want democracy. So they come to the States and say, guys, you want to do business with us, do business with us. But don't tell us how we have to live. At some point, America has to understand that you better trade than teach everyone how to live. Now, it's not nice, but at some point, I think we have to understand these people, not only teach them to be like us. They will not be.
Yeah, so I would also add that to fight, your last point, it doesn't always need to be military fighting as well, right? So we need to fight in the informational space as well. Israel is currently, in my opinion, losing the information war in the West, and you're seeing that on campuses and in polls. There was a recent poll.
Right, but I must tell Eric that, I don't believe in justice. Sorry, one last question, last sentence, okay? I don't believe in justice. Excuse me, not nice saying, but okay. Did ever justice provide security? Give me one example. Did Jews not have justice in Germany in the 20s? Did it help? Did Jews not have justice in Spain before the Inquisition? Did it help? Does anyone is interested in your justice, in our Jewish justice? Who cares? They want money, pride, survival. So Jews, Jews have justice. Come on. So, this informational narrative war, I mean, believe me, I am in advocacy, what we call advocacy, hasbara, right? Many years. I was the first emissary of the Jewish Agency to the advocacy on New York campuses during the Second Intifada. And very, very small story, and I finish. When I was a child in the Soviet Union, hairy Jewish, big nose boy, not looking Russian, okay? And you go to the store, okay, and always you have some Russian hooligans who see a Jew, it's fun. Let's beat him, okay? And believe me, I explained them. And I'm good in explanation. That it's not nice, it's not just. And you know what happened? Surprise. It didn't work. And once, and it's a real story, when I already fell, I took a stone that I found and I broke the nose to their leader. And you know what happened? They came to the store I was going to help me to pack the goods because I was a hero in their view, because I was strong enough to beat them. That worked. So guys, justice is nice, very Jewish, very Jewish. I question its effectivity.
I didn't say justice, but okay.
But Eric, to follow up on the idea of information warfare, and I think the wider concept you might be approaching is full spectrum warfare, is that the same tools of power that malign Middle Eastern actors use against the United States and its allies are also available for the United States and its allies to use against malign Middle East actors. There's an anecdote from after October 7th where a delegation of writers, directors, actors, and other Hollywood producers came to visit Prime Minister Netanyahu in his office. And they said, look, we have all the tools of Hollywood at your disposal, the best graphics, the best storytellers. How do we get the story of October 7th out there? And how are we able to use what the other side has been manipulating for generations of holding their narrative and trying to gather everyone who has been involved in defeating the idea of the Jewish state? And what was the Prime Minister's response? This is an anecdote, so we have to take it maybe with a grain of salt. Number one, I can't control you. Number two, even if I try to control you, you'll do whatever you want anyway. And there's a lesson here that may not be apparent from the story, which is the use of full spectrum warfare, of all the tools of influence, which may come from the most creative people in the private sector, or from government bureaucrats sitting in Washington or in Jerusalem, is that if you are able to mesh the idea of a state or of a front, let's call it the West, taking all of its most creative, most I want to say genius, but most manipulative advertising executives or movie producers or whatever it is, and you bring them into government service and you create a partnership where the politicians and the leaders of those states feel like they are able to have the rules of power, to be able to use it to their advent, but to not have, as Alex says, an ideological agenda behind it. But you pair creativity with protecting national security and a country's interests. So I'll give you an example that Alberto sort of referenced on regarding President Trump's visit to the region. You have Saudi Arabia announced $600 billion of investments in the United States. The Qataris, $1.2 trillion in the United States. And not to be beat by the Qataris, the UAE, $1.4 trillion in investments in the United States. But you now have the architecture of deals where the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Emiratis are all going to have to meet the standard of the United States to do business here. So you have an opportunity for information warfare against those actors which may be engaged in actions or in thoughts or in policy which we consider to be dangerous to U.S. national security interests. The Qataris want to have a quantum computing deal. Good luck getting through CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. If you want to try to do business in Alabama, good job, because MEF just had a bill passed which prevents the Qataris from owning anything which may be considered of an interest to the state of Alabama, not necessarily to the United States. You want to talk about LGBTQIA plus rights? Well, guess what? Good luck doing deals in Democrat majority states. Because by engaging in business with the United States, you now subject yourselves to the interests of the United States. And the second that you come into our borders, the Qatari game and some other pernicious Middle East actors has always been to try to change the way the U.S. does business so it's to their interests. But now with this injection of hundreds of billions of dollars in capital, it's the opportunity for the U.S. to play the same game. So I guess what I'm trying to say, to make a long anecdote followed by analysis and whatever else I said for the last 5 minutes makes sense, is that if the U.S. is able to use the old maxim that imitation is the highest form of flattery, and we improve those tactics against those who try to do us harm, we'll be in a much better position for our national security interests in the region. But also, when those countries and those actors try to hurt us here or try to warp our interests here, we have the ability to do the same thing to them tenfold. And we should, but we're currently not.
Yeah, I agree. With that, I'd like to open it up for questions. Matt, you want to collect? But I did want to say, my point with the full spectrum warfare, as a Marine officer, we're taught to employ what's called combined arms on the battlefield, right? So that's all different aspects in our tools in our toolkit to go after a common objective and synchronize and coordinate that. I believe the U.S. should be doing that. I think we're seeing evidence of that with this latest trip, and we need to maximize that kind of coordination where in previous administrations, my opinion, it's been lacking. Ambassador, we talked prior to the panel, Americans don't do strategy well, right? We suck at it. And there's a reason for that, because of our system where we're constantly vacillating from one policy to another, right? And just in the course of, take a look at Iran, right? So we go from the Obama approach to Trump's first maximum pressure, then back to Biden that is looking for another version of the JCPOA, and now back to some form of maximum pressure. So there's no consistency over time to get to the desired results. So I just wanted to add that because I think that that's what is lacking or what we need to see in the U.S. approach in the next 4 years at least. So with that, we got a couple questions. How should we convince or how can we convince the Palestinians that they are losing or will lose as they think, I guess I can't really read the rest of it, but how do you convince, this is to Dr. Pipe's book, Israel Victory, right? The only way to achieve the victory is to convince the Palestinians to capitulate fully. How do we achieve that?
Well, I think there's a problem because as long as it's open-ended, you know, there's no end game, right? So you can lose, the Palestinian strategy is an obvious one, and that is you can lose once, twice, 100 times on the battlefield. As long as you exist, there's a possibility that at some point you'll do better. You mentioned the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem won many times, defending itself against different Muslim sultans and khans. And then what happened? One day, a Muslim leader of military genius named Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi rose. And they fought him one time, and they lost it all. So this is the challenge. This is the Palestinian strategy, is to kind of lose but continue to exist, right? Lose and prepare for the next time, thinking that at some point the tables of chance, of politics, of the critical mass in the West will turn in their favor. I mean, we don't like that they're doing this, but it's also not rocket science that somebody would try to do that, of course.
Yeah. If I can, I want to switch to a different question about Qatar. One question was, how do we end their influence on college campuses? I think
Sure.
Yeah.
So how do we end Qatar's influence on college campuses? I think the model of how we approach Texas A&M, and there's two models, one for public universities and one for private universities, is what could be followed as sort of the blueprint for removing Qatar from American academia. The case in Texas A&M was an effort led by an organization called Zahwar Legal Institute, which is a great organization that engages in offensive lawfare against enemies of the United States in the West. They had a 7-year campaign to try to get the agreement which established Texas A&M's Doha branch in Education City in Qatar. And what they found out after 7 years of court battles, and eventually took Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, to side with the private plaintiff against the state university to get the agreement, was to unpack what the Qataris were actually interested in getting out of their partnership. A few quick facts before. One, the number of Iranian students at Texas A&M studying physics, electrical engineering, and nuclear engineering is the highest of any other ethnic population or a national population in Qatar itself. I wonder what they're doing with that education when they go home. Two, the amount of intellectual property generated by Texas A&M, both in Texas and in Doha, allows for a 60-40 split, 60% Qatari ownership and 40% Texas A&M ownership. So if you're an inventor and you're looking for quick capital, go to Texas A&M to develop your new product. Just realize it's going to be majority owned by the Qataris for your entire lifespan. And three, Texas A&M and its argument was that we're not spending any taxpayer dollars, Texas taxpayer dollars, on our educational partnership with the Qataris. In fact, they're giving us all the money. But the amount of professors that would go on leave to Doha, the amount of Qataris which would get free scholarships, which would otherwise be to the advent and to the benefit, and the amount of spots for students to study at Texas A&M taken up by others who would come in, even if it was only in the dozens, took opportunity away from Texans or from other Americans that would want to study there. It wasn't the Qataris paying for everything. It was the Qataris coming in, acting as leeches, taking the intellectual property of the university, taking up spots for their students to learn in, and giving all American know-how to Iran. So when these three things became apparent and was imparted to the, I think it's the Board of Visitors or the Board of Directors, Board of Trustees for Texas A&M's university, they said, well, that's probably not a good deal for us. We should probably end that relationship. And now in 2029, it's over. You have to find what the Qataris are looking for and see how that's a liability for the university rather than a benefit. And the same thing applies to private universities, but in that case, you have to go to the alumni base, to the those who are active in the alma mater, its donors. And when you have a situation in Carnegie Mellon or Georgetown or elsewhere, and I think, by the way, Georgetown may start reconsidering its relationship with Doha after Sam Westrop, and we'll talk about that on a panel coming up. So just put a pin in that for a second. Why would Georgetown want to disconnect from Qatar? Think about that. I'm not going to reveal anything. But that's the private university approach that I think we might want to address a little bit later.
Yep.
Eric, let me please just to relate to the question how to convince Palestinians that they lost, okay? Because that's what we do in Israel under the Israel Victory Project. First of all, I encourage all of you to read the book about Israel Victory of Daniel Pipes, and we now translate it to Hebrew to publish it in Israel. And a few things, it's really long, but few things. First of all, not to give up. It's as simple as that, okay? Just not to give up, okay? When they push, not to give them, okay? Not to give them Gaza when they push, not to give them Judea and Samaria when they push, not to give them South Lebanon when they push, and not to give them, and to speak their language, okay? We came back after 2,000 years back home when we occupied, and I'm okay with this word, our most sacred place in 67. They expected us, as they know what they would do, to ruin it and to build ours, right? That's what they do for 2,000 years. What we did, we said, no, guys, we don't touch it. You can stay. We don't rise to the Temple Mount, okay? And we even don't want it. We don't want to fight. So they see it as, wait, if in the most sacred place we don't want to control, so we are not attached to this land, and we don't believe that we are from here. So second thing is we must to believe that we are locals, okay? My mother's last name is Israel. So I believe that I'm local in Israel. Nobody can convince me. I know that I'm from there. And the problem is that many of us, Jews and Israelis, still, after 2,000 years coming back, think that we're not back. We're still in exile. We're still in Europe, in Poland, in America. We speak English. We dress nice. Okay, we want to trade. We have to believe that we're locals and we speak local, not to fight within. And when we fight them, to show them that they lost. And that's exactly, Daniel Pipes speaks about maximum messaging in the book. That's what we now engage some of them. I don't want to give names because we're finished, but some very prominent Israeli security senior official to write a policy paper for us, how we not only defeat Palestinians, but also let them understand that they're defeated. So we are working on it.
How much time? 5 minutes? Okay. I think we have time for one more question, and I was actually going to ask Alex, what are Israel's options if the U.S. does a deal with Iran that kicks the...
To attack?
Yeah.
To attack?
There's some things before attack that we can talk about. Not the last option, the other options available.
There are many options. By the way, attacking, as Greg said rightly, is not only militarily. There are many, many ways of combating and fighting. But I think that we just have to show that we fight back.
But to give a little bit more nuance rather than just fighting back or being the U.S. or even what the private sector can do, and not to take Alex's thunder, but he's right. That ultimately will maybe be what will have to happen. But there is a strategy that David Ben-Gurion adopted at the beginning of Akamat Medinah, the beginning of the State of Israel, which was an outside-in approach. Israel was surrounded by enemies. So who did Ben-Gurion go to? Turkey, Ethiopia, Iran during the time of the Shah. And he found that they were able to pressure from the outside to sort of keep the Arabs off balance. And then after Egypt in 79, Jordan, maybe the Palestinians for 3 days when they were trying to find their footings in Ramallah, Israel started to try to maybe engage with some of its immediate neighbors because it realized that its enemies came from a little bit farther distant shores, especially with the replacement of Iran and Egypt kind of swapping places as the greatest threat to the Jewish state. But taking Ben-Gurion's ideas, you can actually apply the inside-out strategy to Iran. So where Iran has its proxies, Israel can develop its own proxies against Iran, whether it's the Baluchis, whether it's the 46-kilometer border that Armenia shares with Iran, or the 400-plus kilometer border that Azerbaijan shares with Iran. It could get involved with Kurds in the Kandil mountain range. It could end up supporting ethnic Azeris inside of Iran. It could go so far as to encourage the Khuzestani Arabs, or the Avazi Arabs, Michael's going to correct me, to maybe instead of blowing up Iran's oil facilities so they can't import or refine oil, let's just have them not go to work. So there's a lot of ideas which are out there which do not require kinetic action, which can weaken Iran, but you don't have to commit yourself to launching thousands of sorties to destroy hundreds of Iranian nuclear sites. Maybe that'll come to that, but there's a spectrum here, like Eric referred to. You don't have to go right to the end game before you try out some things that currently have not been tried.
And I want just to add that another thing that we also do is to help to support the Iranian people to rise. And we just established, it was Gregg's idea, to establish Iran Freedom Caucus in the Knesset. And we bring senior leaders of Iranian opposition, and you will soon hear about it definitely. We already did. We were the first organization that brought Iranian opposition leader from London, Vahid Beheshti, to speak in the Knesset. And the most important thing was that that voice was heard within Iran when the Iranians understand that Israel supports them and that we don't give up on them, that when they rise, we will help them.
And what happened
Attacking,
the next day? What happened the next day in Tehran?
The next day, we saw support of...
There was these large cranes saying, Bibi, we support you.
Right. We saw
Thanks
support
for
of the Iranian
welcoming Vahid
people.
to Jerusalem.
So attacking, as Gregg is right, is not only militarily, it's on all fronts, and economically as well. Being an exporter of gas to Europe is fighting. Okay, fighting Russia on the most important market, Qatar on the most important market, and to think big.
What about you, Ambassador? Do you have anything to add?
Look, I agree that you can see the region and you see, for example, the Arab world is a real mess. There are three rising non-Arab powers, Israel, Turkey, and Iran. Turkey and Iran, especially Iran, we've seen the axis of revolution and them projecting all these allies and stuff like that. But Iran is internally also is filled with weaknesses, which have not been fully exploited, certainly not by the West. So certainly kind of doing to them what they've done to you. You could say an axis of revolution leading, followed by an axis of counter-revolution, right? They are supremely susceptible to, you have Persian control over Iran, a country filled, which half the population are not Persians. So certainly that makes a lot of sense.
I think we're short on time, right? But before we finish, Alex's point about justice, it rang a bell for me. Does anybody know what the original name of the operation was for us post 9/11 to go into Afghanistan? It was Infinite Justice. Okay? Operation Infinite Justice. And we changed the name because it offended Muslims, because only Allah can deliver infinite justice. And that's why we called it Operation Enduring Freedom. And so I make that point to say, here we are, we were attacked, we're going to war, and we're concerned about the other feelings. I believe the U.S. and the West need to fight for their own civilizational values, and I believe that that's the only approach that will actually see results in the region. So with that, I want to thank the panel, and thank you all.